You're listening to Forge Theater Labs,
a podcast devoted to exploring theater history. Where does that idea come from?
concepts in storytelling.
Is anything that original?
Isn't that just an assumption?
And the creation of theater from behind the scenes.
How do they even do that?
This is Forge Theater Labs.
History, innovation, perspective.
Welcome to Forge Theater Labs. I'm your host, Josh Hsu, and today we're talking with director Nelson T. Eusebio III. Nelson is a director and producer who forges theater centered on equity and innovation. A first-generation Filipino-American and Marine Corps veteran, Nelson has directed for the Oregon Shakespeare Festival, Baltimore Center Stage, and the Rep of St. Louis. He previously served as the Associate Artistic Director at KC Rep, where he launched KC Rep for All, a landmark touring initiative for underserved communities. A Yale MFA graduate and art equity facilitator, Nelson's work spans from experimental residencies at Mabu Mines to national broadcasts. He believes the how of theater making is as vital as the what. Nelson is also the author of the influential essay On the Merits of Yellowface, which continue to shape conversations about casting merit and accountability in our field. In 2016, Nelson helped lead Beyond Orientalism, a national movement against yellowface, a harmful casting practice. Beyond Orientalism was a movement led by AAPAC New York, the Smithsonian, Asian American Arts Alliance, and TCG. Welcome, Nelson.
Hi, Josh. Good to see you.
I'm really excited to talk about today, specifically about how directors and casting directors have to navigate real-world constraints, time, pressure, and precedent, while being asked to make decisions that carry artistic, ethical, and personal weight. And so I thought we'd dive right in and start with this sort of initial question, which is, when you hear the phrase, "we cast the best actor for the role," what's the first follow-up question you now instinctively ask?
I would say that when I hear that question, my first question is always, best according to who? And who is the we here, right? We cast the best actor in the role. Is it the director, the casting director, the producer? Because honestly, once you know who actually has decision-making power, then you can start to interrogate their biases, their impact, their accountability. And honestly, when someone starts asking that question of like, that's usually the answer to someone asking you about casting, right? So already just concern about the optics or the harm of casting said actor. So if we're asking, then who is the person who decided to cast that actor? Who's the we in this situation or in this scenario?
I think that's absolutely true. Like, there is that sort of immediate ask of like, if you have to ask, already you're bringing your bias to the forefront in your mind, and you need to sort of follow up and interrogate, what that question has led to. What's a conversation you find that directors and casting directors tend to avoid having with each other that you think maybe we need to have more of, right? Like, in that process of like, when that sort of question comes up, like, who's the best actor for the role, right? Like, what does that sort of immediate conversation need to be?
Right. I think it comes down to a couple things. For me, I think one of the questions that we're definitely not having enough of, and this is just on a craft level, is we're not talking plainly enough about, how the actor is over a period of time, their level of professionalism. We always hear casting directors say things like, "Oh, they're great in the room." Well, that's great in this room in the 5 or 10 minutes that you're auditioning for us. But we don't always ask, are they still going to be a good colleague in like Oklahoma City 2 months into this run? How are they going to be in the middle of tech and in a 10 out of 12? So that brings up questions about reliability, generosity, how they handle notes, like what is their artistry and how does that technique or their process interface with your own? And there are some assumptions that get made in that, and sometimes I think casting directors think, oh, we're being a little gossipy about that, but it's actually not about gossip. It's actually about protecting the room, protecting the show, and your own process too, right? Like, we don't want to invite bad actors, and by bad actors, I don't mean like people who can't act. I mean bad actors as in people who act poorly as human beings and as citizens and artists into your process. So I think that's definitely one of the things that we don't, as directors and casting directors, talk about. There's an assumption there, right, that deserves to be questioned. Um, and then, does that answer your question, Josh, or
Yeah,
am I missing
absolutely.
something?
Absolutely. And I think there is, for every director, you and me both, there are actors that we love working with because there is a shorthand that's involved, right? I do think that sometimes that can lead to bias, right, within the room, like our own biases about how we perceive a show and how we do that without sort of considering optics because we're comfortable within that room, right? I think, I want to point out in your essay on the merits of Yellowface, you argue that merit is shaped by a bias, access, and cultural conditioning, not just objective truth. So, for practitioners listening, how do we interrogate our instincts without paralyzing the process, right? How do we interrogate our instincts while also trusting that we know perhaps who might be best in this role?
Sure. So I think from a very practical level, I think one of the things you do individually, like with the casting director, yourself, whoever your producer, if you want, after a full day of seeing folks, um, I tell people, follow your instincts. Like, write all that stuff down. Don't share with one another. We're not sharing with the classes. We're not at that point yet. But everybody, from their own lens, write down who is their dream cast of, either just in general, like this could be before auditions start, or it could be after we had a full day of auditions. It's like, write down who you'd like. Um, and then let's each person presents that. Let's all write it down. And then looking at that, so basically it's like follow your instincts and then interrogate them. Make your list of who feels right, and then ask, look at this list of folks, your top choices, and go, well, who's missing? Who's not here? You can use simple lenses: race, gender, ability, um, even sexual orientation. Sometimes, like, that may or may not read in an actor's performance. Um, but use those lenses. But, and I don't want to emphasize this, like, don't stop at the sort of black white binary when it comes to race. Asians, Latina, indigenous folks are often not thought of, or falling out of the frame, or not even included, or they're not even in your room. Um, and let's also name this. Sometimes casting directors genuinely, they don't have access to those communities, right? Um, I mean, I can't count the amount of times I've been asked to help cast a wide net of AAPI actors, only to have an organization say, "We already know those people. Do you know anyone else?" And as if I was their casting director on retainer, you know. So interrogating our instinct by saying who is not here, um, is one part of it. But we also want to make sure that if we are trying to bring in folks who the casting directors may not have connections to that community, or the director may not have connections to that community, that are willing to resource that, or are we just willing to say, hey, we're missing this particular kind? We didn't see any folks in this particular lane. Can we see more folks? Like, do you know some differently able folks? Do you know some indigenous folks? Could we see them for this role? So again, it's not that our instincts are wrong necessarily, but let's all sort of in a similar way to like art making, like, let's get those initial instincts out there, and then once we have those, let's really be rigorous in terms of examining that lens of who is here, who's not here. Oh, that's an interesting thought, or oh, we're considering that person. I hadn't thought about that. What does that mean to put that identity on stage, and especially if that's the only identity, right? The
Yep.
example I like to use is like, if you're doing Streetcar and you decide you're going to cast an African American or Black Stanley, and he's the only Black character on stage. Well, what are we saying about
Mhm.
Black folks in the world? Like, are we ready to stand behind that? What kind of artistic statement are we making? It's impossible to separate our symbol, our ethnic or cultural identities uh, from the storytelling the storytelling and implications of putting Black and brown bodies on stage.
Absolutely. I think back to one of my early experiences when I was acting, and I was cast in a show. I won't call out anybody particularly, but when the casting broke down, it seemed like all of the main roles that were in a particular role were white, and all the people of color were cast in either doctor roles, banker roles, almost to the point of uh, parody. And while that show was a comedy, it was a country wife. Like, I do think that the message that was conveyed was that minorities belong in supporting roles, and it was before this conversation could be had. And when the cast sort of reacted to the casting, we still did the show the way it was, but it was very much like the minorities were very clear about like how this casting impacted their perception of themselves. And I think having that conversation now today is a very different conversation. I do think that, I want to highlight that point where you said like having different people in the room. I think too often directors have so much sway in the room. And so I think it's really important for us to sort of remember, having that other person to check our instincts, to sort of stop us from, just saying, this is the way I want the cast to be, having someone to say, have you looked at it from this different perspective? Right. And if we're working with a casting director, be able to say, hey, have we looked at it from a different perspective? How do you personally distinguish between aesthetic preference and structural exclusion? Like, what are some examples that you use as you're considering?
That's a good question. I think for me, structural exclusion is about patterns. Groups who historically don't show up on our stages, that look like you and me, are not often centered in a lot of stories. Folks that look, just people of color. So those that's like one part of it, right? Like, who's for me, like I said, structural inclusion is about um, people like us whose stories aren't centered because of larger white supremacist culture has kept them out of training, out of networks, out of our imagination, out of the stories of our makers. Um, and I feel like aesthetic presence, and I don't use that phrase, but like, forgive me if I'm trying to unpack it a little. Um, does this person's presence and way of moving through the world add something essential to to the production? It's like, like, look, like, people have types of people they like dating, right?
Yeah.
Like, for there was definitely a period of time in my life where emotionally unavailable white women were like this kryptonite that I couldn't stop dating, right? Like the same way like women date bad boys, like whatever it is, just because you have a bias towards it doesn't make it a healthy thing. Um, and at the very least, I think for aesthetic presence, like for me, it's like after I've answered the structural question, if my preferences keep pointing me back to like the same type of body and identity, then that's not taste. That's not aesthetic presence. That's just exclusion, right? I'm not seeing someone else in that role. Like, does the woman who serves baguettes in, have to be, um, uh, does she have to, what is my idea of a baker, right? Like, does she have to be like a, a certain type of body type, or can they also be younger and more youthful and more like an ingenue? It sort of depends, right? And one of the places that sort of gets down to that I think we should talk about it at some point is the like you mentioned earlier, the casting breakdown. Um, they're like, nobody names things nowadays in that same way. Like we see a lot of casting breakdowns say open to all ethnicities and genders, but then we also see things like all American or strong masculine, blah, blah, blah. Like there are these sort of dog whistle or coded language that we're using in these particular casting breakdowns that I think casting directors themselves read between the lines as well and directors do too. Like we're trying to name a specific identity or body type without actually coming out and saying that.
Absolutely. I think, I'm always looking for those sort of making sure that like when we create a casting breakdown, that those coded words don't exist, that, we're actually getting to the heart of the character and not just an aesthetic, right? The aesthetic may be a byproduct of the nature of that character. But it's not necessarily like, my Biff doesn't have to have a six pack every single time when I'm thinking of Death of the Salesman. And
Right.
so And I think too often we sort of use these sort of icons to sort of create our perfect cast, right? Like we think about how would this Hollywood production look if I had unlimited budget and I wanted to cast it, perfectly. I think this is a great conversation to start with. I think, our next step is to talk a little bit about sort of, some of the more recent controversies that have sort of plagued Broadway. We're going to take a small break, but we'll be back. We'll talk to Nelson T. Eusebio III, director, producer, and old friend of mine. We'll be right back.
At Forge Theater Labs, we're building bold, imaginative theater, supporting new artists, new stories, and new ways of experiencing performance. We're proud to share that Forge Theater Labs is now a sponsored project of Fractured Atlas, which means your donations are tax deductible and directly support the creation of this podcast, live tapings, and artist-driven projects. If our work has inspired you, made you think, or brought you closer to the theater community, we invite you to help keep it going. You can make a donation by visiting forgetheaterlabs.com for our link to our Fractured Atlas page. Every contribution, big or small, helps us forge new pathways for artists and audiences alike. Thank you for being part of our community.
I want to take a moment now to sort of pivot to talk about what happens when a single casting decision becomes an industry-wide flashpoint. As you all may have heard, the Broadway musical Maybe Happy Ending, a show with deep cultural roots and a history of Asian representation, sparked widespread debate when a non-Asian performer was cast in a role previously played by Asian actors, raising questions about representation, precedent, and responsibility. And so, Nelson, I just want to sort of start with this sort of first thing so we can provide some context for our listeners. From a director and a casting director perspective, what made this particular decision land so loudly in the field?
That's a great question. I would say the reason this casting decision landed so loudly in is because Maybe Happy Ending is one of the very few Broadway musicals in the history of Broadway that centers Asian and Asian American performers. It's a story that's rooted in a Korean context. So when a white actor intentionally or unintentionally steps into a lead role that has historically been played by an Asian actor in that rare space, it doesn't feel like it's just one casting choice. It feels like a precedent. It feels like erasure, and that can be harmful to both the outer community, the community of AAPI artists and audiences, and then also for that poor actor themselves, right? Who is joining this company that has been created, this role and this story have been told by a predominantly Asian cast, and they're the outsider, and they are not necessarily responsible for creating this situation. They were offered an opportunity, and like many actors, they just took it. And then the producer can say things like, "Well, it's a robot; anyone can play it." But it's because we're talking specifically about the Darren Criss casting, right?
Mm-hmm.
But it's not just any robot; it's a Korean robot in a show that many people in our community see as a rare sign of representation. So then, intentionally or unintentionally, the impact of that, the message becomes: Asian actors are good enough to build the value of the piece, but they're not necessary to sustain it, and we'd like to remove you as quickly as possible. Even if the intent is benign, right? Like they didn't really, I'm pretty sure the producers didn't think this through. The impact is real. And we've already seen do you remember those unauthorized productions of Hamilton that were taking place with all white casts in like a high school, and how that flattens the original politics and intention of what Lin meant in casting it that way? So again, to mirror that here, if we normalize swapping white actors into AAPI roles at the top of the pipeline, this is on Broadway, right? This is before we do the tour, before there's the high school production, before there's the community theater production of Maybe Happy Ending. By setting this historical precedent, the impact cascades all the way down, potentially, across the field and across the history of the piece. So I think that's the number one reason it was such a big shot across the bow. I think, you know, when we are in a place as a community, we're already in a place of scarcity, and it feels like you're taking. It feels like it's not intended, but it feels like you're taking an opportunity away from an API actor.
You know, like I think that's absolutely true. I think we've also seen on Broadway at the same time this idea of like, you know, taking away roles from unknowns, unestablished, you know, workers. And I think also as a result, that means also people of color tend to be, you know, minimized as well. What is meaningful accountability? You know, like the decision's been made, we've cast this person, that poor actor now has to enter the room and deal with the fallout of that. Like, what does meaningful accountability look like once the decision's been made public? Like, where do we go from there? Do we retract that? Because, you know, opportunities on Broadway are rare, even, you know, especially for those unknowns. So
Right.
what does that look like? You know, how do we come back from that? And how do we own that?
Sure. I mean, I want to say, like, having been a producer where and been on the other side of these kinds of situations, not necessarily like a Broadway producer, but as a producer at the regional theater level. Look, man, commercial realities, especially in commercial theater, absolutely matter. And so, but so does brand trust, like build the trust in this brand or trust in this story. So when a production like maybe happening, you know, accidentally or intentionally disregards cultural context, and the backlash, like, again, we're talking about this, right? Like, can outweigh the short-term ticket bump that like a name provides. I mean, honestly, I couldn't actually tell you the name of the gentleman that they were subbing in for this particular role, and that tells you that, you know, the real question isn't does the name sell? It's does the name strengthen this specific story or distort it? Right? If casting undermines the cultural integrity of the piece, you're not just taking a representational risk, you're taking a financial one. So I'd want the decision made with eyes as wide open as possible, with clear messaging, and also in conversation with the artists involved. Right? Don't just make the decision and then go, oh, everything's on fire. We're really upset now, and then have to come up with some clumsy messaging. Why is there not cultural strategy around, if we decide to do this, here are some potential here's some potential fallout or blowback that may occur. Um, so like I said, it's like all the decision once it's made, or it has to be made with eyes wide open, with clear messaging around why we're doing this, and in conversation with the artist involved, so that way they can be an ambassador for the choice and for the decision. And all of this requires just strategic thinking around this, which I think in many ways is the thing that we're talking about, right? Like, let's actually talk about what it means if we want to diversify our casting. Let's talk about what that actually means to put those bodies in these stages, in these roles, right? So I'll provide this example. So when I was directing 12th Night, we at KC Rep, we just made the decision to have a female Malvolio. So we made a Malvolia, right? I think we were 3/4 of the way through we might have been in tech, I think. And someone told someone, it got to me that they felt like because of the treatment of Malvolia and because Malvolia was the only same-sex relationship in the play, that they felt like the production was homophobic. And so we went back, and this is a tough, right? In that, like, you have to calibrate this, in that, like, people are laughing at Malvolio not because she is gay and in love with Olivia. They're laughing at Malvolio because she's a ridiculous character who's obnoxious as hell, right? And that's separate from their gender identity. And so looking for understanding that, like, even from the beginning, I knew that this was a potential or a possibility. Like, I had not built-in controls, but I was able to calibrate, not from, oh my God, I've never thought of this, but from a place of, this is an area of potential concern. And so again, just using this as an example to reinforce the idea of strategic thinking around casting.
Absolutely. And I think having perhaps somebody in the room whose role it is to engage with that thought process, maybe even separate from the director, right? Maybe even separate from the casting director, because our brand is story, right? Like that is at the heart of theater, is our brand is around that story, and the story we build will have consequences, will last for a time to come, and will have a cultural impact. Hopefully, the most successful shows do. And so, placing that within a framework to begin with, I think sets us up for success. I think we have equity coordinators. I've worked with equity coordinators on shows to make sure that messaging around it works. When I directed Straight White Men, we had an equity coordinator to make sure that we weren't just using trans people and trans people of color as props within a given show, specifically the name of the show, because it sort of represented the framing. And so, for those of you who don't know, Maya Williams, who is also a co-host on the show, was also in that show as well. And that was a large part of our discussion when setting up the rehearsal process. What are some other sort of practices that we can perhaps do early on? Like, let's say like we hit the rehearsal space. What is it at that time? The casting has been made. We're all in the room. What sort of places can we sort of insert into the rehearsal process? Because obviously somebody came up to you and was open enough for them to ask you, hey, I do think that this sort of portrayal of Malvolio might be homophobic. So like, what are some sort of institutional practices we can add into the rehearsal room?
Right. Before I answer that question, is it okay? I want to give people a couple of things for like the sort of toolkit before we even get to that.
Sure.
We already touched on examining the breakdowns, phrases like all American or masculine or things like that. So there's a subtextual thing. So examining those. One thing I would encourage at auditions is to make space for everyone else's opinions. I mean, avoid saying you have a favorite at all, or like save that for absolutely last. Because what happens, right, is because generally directors have the most amount of power in the room. It's like the minute you say, "Oh, I love, Josh for this role," like nobody's going to tell you about how much they really think this role could be really cool if Eileen was playing it, right? Because you've already said that you like Josh. So one of the things that I think that if you take nothing else useful from this podcast, one of the things I would encourage is for the directors, hold off on declaring your preferences last. Make space in the room for other people's opinions, and not just the casting director, absolutely, but like if you have readers, what's their experience? Because they're the ones who are actually acting with the person. They may pick up on things, and they may be like, "This person is cool," or "This person, is just dead behind the eyes." Like, and you miss that in between looking at their resume and like hearing the play in the way that you want it, hearing that monologue the way you want it. So I think those are two things. And then what I try and encourage casting directors to do, they kind of already do this on their own, at least the good ones do. When you're sending your call out, bring me like one or two wild cards, people you think, hey, this person might not be right for this role, but what the heck? Or this person is a great actor and they're fun to have in a room, and they may not have something here, or they might be a great fit for something you weren't thinking of. At the very least, that expands your network professionally, and it also, again, keeps expanding what the potential and what the possibilities are, and hopefully increases opportunity.
I love that advice, like inserting the wild card into the room. I love working with wild cards because oftentimes they come into the room and they're like, why am I here? What am I doing in this space playing this role in particular? And giving them the space to experiment and to sort of say, we want to see what you can bring, often creates enormous goodwill as a result. And so I encourage you to sort of think outside the box, go wild with your choices from time to time and see what it brings, because it may create a different story than what you expected. So that's a great. Yeah, go ahead.
Oh, I was going to say like toolkit. So that's toolkit pre-pro or pre-casting, pre-rehearsal. You asked what we could do to building things into the rehearsal process. I think one of the things you can do is from the very beginning, you can work with a cast and you can create a series of, this is very anti-racist, but in the practice, but it's helpful, like creating a set of group agreements, right? Like, and those group agreements can be every from, step up and then step back, or don't take up too much room. Um, my favorite one is wait, why am I talking? Like, especially directors, like we love to talk. Um, so I think generally trying to make it so that you're not listening to my voice for 8 hours a day, and you get to listen to your own voices and hear from the other people in the company. You want to sort of, like I said, one of the ways is to have a set of group agreements, and you can talk them through. You can be like, here are 5 group agreements I find that are useful ways to work together, right? So that there's a shared set of understanding. It's not just assume that like you're going to show up and blah blah blah. Like, sometimes you have to name that stuff. You have to say, especially with how fragile folks are nowadays. It's like we need to name those biases. We need to name what's at risk, and also, this sounds like such a small thing, but like those sort of morning check-ins of like, hey, how's everyone feeling today? Let's take 5 minutes to talk, and then the other person spends 5 minutes listening, and then you swap places. That's one place where you can start to make that space. And then also, and I cannot say this enough, just the same way you make space for other folks' opinions in the casting department, you want to do that same thing with the people who are both inside and outside of the production. Making space for if making space for actors to both take their break, but also, when we come back from break, if you're feeling like we're working on a very emotionally fraught scene, hey, this has been 3 hours of us working on you looking like an idiot. Like, how are we feeling? Where are we at with that? And also, and I find this is actually helpful, naming the story that you're trying to tell, and how you're afraid of it being perceived, right? Oh, I love the fact that like one of the things that we talked. I'm just going to name a very specific example. I was directing Love Labor's Lost for the Play On podcast series, and in one point, and we set it in an HBCU in Howard in like the 1930s. But there's some language that Shakespeare uses around black and making fun of a specific character about her being too black. And so we had a long conversation about colorism around this. Um, but this is the kind of conversation you only have with a cast of color. But like really uplifting it and talking to our white producer and seeing if there was workarounds, or how harmful is this to put this is a truthful thing, right? Colorism in communities is a real issue. Is that something we want to name in this particular story that we're telling, or does it just distract from this rom-com that we're telling? So, unpacking these issues and making space for them and encouraging folks to talk about them, I think on a consistent basis, not just like when we have all the time in the world at the beginning of rehearsal. Though I will say, when you have all the time in the world at the beginning of rehearsal, that's the easiest time to start to set those precedents. And because then if you take them away later, people get upset, right? They're like, what happened to our 5-minute check-in, or what happened to this or that? And it's like, put those systems in place at the top, and then you'll find later that if people are uncomfortable about things, oftentimes they'll have a venue or a way, whether it's like anonymously or like off to the side or after rehearsal conversation. But again, finding ways to encourage to make space for that, and understanding that feedback, while it can be challenging, is also welcomed. We're trying to make better art. We're trying to make more equitable art. We're trying to be better people in the creation of our art. We're far too old to be doing the like, I'm tortured artist and everyone's having a bad time, but we're making something great.
Absolutely. I think that sort of comes with age. Was like when you start out, you're the tortured theater director, trying to fight against the machine. And then you're like, wait, I just want to find some joy in this space. But heading back to that sort of conversation, I love that idea of like checking in. I do this with every beat within a play, which is, what is the story we're trying to tell with this beat? But I love that sort of secondary question, which is, what are we afraid is going to come off if we do this wrong? Like, what are the sort of pitfalls of this scene? What are we trying to avoid? I think this is just good practice as a storyteller anyway, right? That way you can sort of start to sort of brainstorm those unforeseen consequences, the way that somebody might feel offended. Now, if it's your purpose to offend, then you have even a better choice, right? Like there are times where I'm like, I'm not afraid to be a confrontational director with some of my work. And so if an audience feels offended, all the better, right? Like that was my intent there. That was the goal there. But knowing what the intent between, not just between the characters, but between the audience and the character itself, I think is such a central part to that. We're going to take a short break. We'll be right back. We're going to talk a little bit more, wrap things up, learn a little bit more what Nelson is up to. I'm Josh Hsu. You're listening to Forge Theater Labs. Want to get your brand in front of a passionate, creative, and engaged audience? Forge Theater Labs is looking for partners to sponsor this podcast and join us in bringing bold, innovative theater to life. If you'd like to place an ad right here, reach out to us at marketing@forgetheaterlabs.com. It's a simple, powerful way to support the arts while sharing your message with listeners who care about creativity and community. Again, that's marketing@forgetheaterlabs.com. Let's build something extraordinary together. Welcome back to Forge Theater Labs. This is Josh Hsu, and I'm speaking to Nelson T. Eusebio about his experience as a director, as a casting director. And we've been spending a lot of time talking about, how we can sort of have a toolbox to help avoid our biases, help break through systems that are in place that perhaps perpetuate stereotypes that are harmful to our communities. But I want to sort of talk about sort of, take ourselves to task, which is, what is one casting assumption you find yourself actively unlearning?
I think the idea that the casting even can be neutral, right? And by that, for a while, it was like we had color blind casting or diversity. I don't see color. I just see an actor or an artist. As if being an artist isn't colored by who we are as people and the bodies and the identities that we grew up in. We thought that colorblind casting was a progressive ideal. But I think what I'm learning is that identity isn't something that you subtract or try and minimize or make minor. It's something that you integrate. The politics of who is on stage is part of the storytelling, not separate from it. And I would say that approach has extended itself into the way that I approach classics now, where I'm actively shaping the design to fit the identity of the actor. So, like for 12th Night, our Olivia was Brazilian, so we set Olivia's house with a lot of Brazilian music, Brazilian flowers, Brazilian plants. So her experience of Brazil, specifically that like sort of 60s bossa nova vibe, like it was all shaped around that. And obviously people's relationship to their identities is different, right? Like your relationship to your background is different than my relationship to my background. That shows up, how that activates in our life. I'm so interested in talking to artists of color around that and seeing if that becomes the inspiration for the work. So, for example, one quick example is that, we did Cyrano with James Chen, who's a Chinese American actor and good friend with really the first Asian American Cyrano in American regional theater history. So when we got to the Battle of the 100, which is that big battle that Cyrano fights, rather than Cyrano fighting with a traditional like French sword play, he used. We were very much inspired by, the wuxia films like Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon. So he fought with Jian sword. He fought in that wuxia sort of style, and we connected that. We were also very inspired by like, Old Boy. So there's like a long hallway sequence to fight. And there are a lot of these places that you're borrowing from people's cultural, not borrowing, but you're inspired by people's cultural identities. And rather than it being, Orsino played by a black actor, it's Black Orsino, right? It's not an Asian actor playing Cyrano. It's Asian American Cyrano in France in this particular period of time. Rather than our cultural identities being something that you have to see past. Let's celebrate that and enhance that and enrich that. And so, what does it mean to tell the story of Cyrano, the greatest romance in history, from the perspective of the masculine identity that is most erased and considered the least masculine? What if we made the most beautiful woman in the world an African American Black woman? What if we made the most handsome romantic guy, Christian? Yes, he's Latin, but he's terrible with women. So, taking these sort of cultural assumptions and getting to explore them and in some ways deconstruct them and make for a richer story. These are the kind of opportunities that our white actor counterparts and white director and white storytellers have had for years. So it seems only natural that we would eventually take the sort of tools of the master and use them in our own way.
Absolutely. I love that idea of sort of appropriating that and sort of building the concept of a production to a certain extent around the casting is fantastic, and sort of leaning into these stories, taking these sort of older stories and making them culturally appropriate for those playing them. That I think is so innovative, and it sort of is. I'm so intrigued to see where it heads. Something that I'm always reminded of, as a person of color is that, I can't assume just because I am a person of color that my experience as a Chinese person growing up in New York is identical to the same person growing up in New York, right? Maybe even in the same space. And I think one of the things that I'm always at the front of my mind is sort of that multiplicity of experience when it comes to people of color, and sort of bring that to the forefront in our productions, is that there is no one way, this is the way Chinese people live. And, we all experienced the Joy Luck Club growing up. It's not true. My mother did, but, like a lot of us did not. And so, I do feel like we identify in different ways to certain things. And so I think, seeing films that sort of, and movies and theater that sort of demonstrates that sort of divergent pathways and experience has been super powerful to me. Um, with that in mind, is that something that you hope becomes normalized in the next 5 years of the field? Like, is that something that you hope to like bring to the forefront, or is it, is there something else?
No, look, I would love nothing more than the idea of, color conscious and casting and taking classics and really tailoring them to BIPOC bodies and BIPOC stories. I love that. And I hope that our field will eventually arrive there. And so, yes, but I think when I think of like casting in the future, I think basic things like, to me, like, making sure that we know people's pronouns as they're coming in. It's been a minute since most of the auditions now have shifted to online, but that bringing people's pronouns and their gender identity, I think, into the casting room is helpful. I think it's a dangerous thing in terms of when people walk in to assume their cultural identity, and it's certainly not legal to ask about it. And there have been some examples of AAPI stories where the casting folks, engages some not so ethical kinds of questions around these kinds of things. And I think that part of it is actors wanting to feel like they can play anything, but part of it is the fact that people are scared, right? They're scared in a very terrifying world now. They're scared to identify as people of color because of the current political climate. I think that what I would love to see in the next 5 years that's more normalized is an understanding from the casting directors of what it means to put the politics and the optics and the implications of making these casting choices. Not that, hey, these are your casting choices and hey, good luck, the director did it or the producer decided it. It's like, how about we all have some level of accountability and act appropriately within that. That's not me scolding. I want to be clear about that. I think that what I've named is traditionally how casting directors have approached it. And I think that the idea that like we're all together sharing the burden of this part of the storytelling and the implications for this for both our audiences, for our relationship with the casting director business, with the actors and artists involved, I very much wanted to be a little more aware and conscious of the questions and concerns that will be coming down the pike if you make certain decisions. Yeah, that's all. I mean, and that comes down to not just, again, when you're doing BIPOC stories with BIPOC folks, but if we're doing a production of I can't think of Doll's House 2, right? And our cast is all white. Like, it's worth and even if the director's white, it's still worth naming. Hey, just so you know, this is what we have. We have an all white cast. I just want to point that out before we move on before we get to offers, right? Because honestly, like we talked about before, people have biases, people have blind spots. A rather notable off-Broadway theater, I came out with an entire season of all male playwrights, and that theater was at the time by a woman, and a prominent female playwright spoke out and said that artistic leaders should have known better. And that just goes to show you that there's so much power and so much privilege that no one is willing to speak out to them. And I would love it if casting directors felt empowered and felt like they could speak up and say, just to name the power dynamics in the room, just to name what we're doing. That's all. You don't have to hold people, like, that's the only level of accountability I think required in that moment. It's not, wouldn't expect you to solve racism. Like, that's the running joke I have as an art equity facilitator. Whenever I come to institutions, I was like, today we're going to solve racism in 5.5 hours. And it's like, no, man, we're not going to do that. But are we going to become a little more intelligent, a little more aware, a little more accepting, and a little more human? Yes. And that, at this point in my career, I think if we just are moving in that direction with casting directors and having a greater level of accountability, that's a win.
Tiny, tiny baby steps for the win.
Yes.
Any resources you recommend, for directors and casting directors doing this work seriously?
Yeah, absolutely. APAC, Asian American Performance Action Coalition, NYC, the Tony and Obie award-winning organization that I helped start and my wife is on the steering committee for. Plug. APAC has a toolkit that you can get on their website and download for free. They also publish the statistics every year of, and have done so for the last 10 years, of the ethnic and cultural makeup and racial makeup of Broadway and off-Broadway. And that it started out just doing the performers, but now is extended to the playwrights and the designers and the directors. Those are eye-opening numbers, I think, for anybody who thinks that this is not a problem. But they have a toolkit to download. They're absolutely useful. I would say the whole series of essays on Yellowface that are available at HowlRound are absolutely worth looking at in terms of those things. And I would be, so let me just start with those things.
Yeah, and I don't want our listeners not to read your essay. So where can listeners read your essay and follow your work?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much. You can find my essay on the merits of Yellowface at the HowlRound website, howlround.com. You can find my samples of my work at NelsonEusebio.com. That's NelsonEusebio.com. There's a brand new plug. There's a brand new reel on there of the last 2 to 3 years of work. This work like Cyrano, 12th Night that we've referenced here, Cambodian Rock Band, and Kim's Convenience, because I directed the non-Canadian premiere before the current one. But yeah, I directed that at Theater Square and at Westport Country Playhouse. So you can see my work there. And you can find me on the Instagram at NeldDog7. That's NELDOGG7. Not the best place to find me, but I would start with the website, and then the HowlRound stuff and APAC NYC is a great toolkit for folks.
And listeners, if you're interested, you can also find his bio and all those links on our website. Thanks so much, Nelson, for joining us today. Always a pleasure to catch up with you.
Yeah, good to see you, Josh. Thank you so much for the opportunity.
And this is Forge Theater Labs. We'll see you next time.
This episode was hosted by Joshua N Hsu with post-production by Sam Rappaport.